Welcome to the Ask Historians podcast.
Hello, listeners. This is Cassidy Prococo, known as Mimicofmodes on the subreddit and elsewhere. I am so pleased to welcome Dr. Miranda Kaufmann to the Ask Historians podcast. Dr. Kaufmann is the author of Black Tutors, The Untold Story, and Heiresses, Marriage, Inheritance, and Caribbean Slavery. Recently out in the UK, and as of recording this, shortly to be out in the US. Thank you so much for coming on our show to talk about your new book.
Thanks, great to be here.
Can I ask, to get us started, what brought you to this specific topic?
Well, back in 2006, I was commissioned to do a survey of English heritage country house properties for links between those properties and enslavement and abolition in the run up to the bicentenary of the British abolition of the trafficking of enslaved Africans in 1807. And they gave me a list of 33 properties that they said were active in that period. And so I went through those and I found 26 of them had some kind of link, and we were looking for all sorts of links, like people who invested in slaving voyages or owned plantations, but also dealt in goods produced by enslaved people like tobacco or sugar, and a whole load of other connections, maybe through Parliament or the legal system. But one of the categories was heiresses. And that's quite interesting because, so if you go and look at Smith Hall in Lancashire, it's not a real place, and it was owned by the Smith family for, seven generations. And you look up the Smith family and there's no records of any Smiths doing any of these things. You might think that there's no connection, but then if you find that Mr. Smith III married a Miss Jones of Jamaica in the 1780s, and she brought her dowry with her, or sometimes even had inherited estates herself, then you then get that clear connection to the profits of enslavement through marriage. So near the top of the list was Battle Abbey, which was built on the site of the Battle of Hastings. And Sir Godfrey Webster married Elizabeth Vassall of Jamaica in 1786. And that's just the beginning of the story. But she had such a crazy life that she definitely had to be in the book. So then it was a back burner thing for quite a lot of it was a back burner thing while I finished my PhD, wrote Black Tudors, had 2 kids, and then finally I was let loose on the heiresses.
I did actually see that report. I looked into it while I was writing an answer to a question on the subreddit, actually. I was like, oh, this is so useful. I'm so glad somebody compiled this.
Oh, great. Well, glad to hear that. That's great.
So at the beginning of the book, you explain some terminology that you use to discuss slavery. Can you sort of talk through the shift in terminology from earlier, maybe more vernacular ways that people speak about slaves versus enslaved people and so on?
I think I need to turn to the page in my book to right at the beginning, the note on language, just to check I don't leave anything out. I think people who have a personal interest in this history or are studying it, or both, have had a long conversation about this and feel that terms like slave can be dehumanizing, and we don't want to just reproduce the language used by the enslavers. So we're now talking about enslaved people with the emphasis on people, and to show that it was sort of a status imposed upon them rather than their whole identity. And that kind of extends to enslavement, enslaver, I suppose when looking at the trafficking, again, sort of trying to avoid the phrase the slave trade, because that really just sounds like another commodity, like sugar trade, tobacco trade, cotton trade. But although there is an element of recognizing that was how people were treated, but at the same time, so the shift is to try and be more human and humane in the way that we're talking about people, men, women, children, and I tried to do that in the book. And then there's also There's also a shift, an important change in the way that we talk about relations between enslavers and the enslaved women, or sometimes free women of mixed heritage, that they have sex with, on a kind of wide range of sort of rape to just sort of coercive control, long-term relationships. Even relationships where you find affectionate language, or even sort of people being women, these women and their children being left legacies in wills. We still have to recognize that it's an incredibly unequal relationship in the power dynamic, and just sort of be sensitive to that. And I think also, talking about mixed ancestry or mixed heritage, because mixed race sort of implies that there are such things as biological races, whereas in fact we're all a bit mixed up, and there is no sort of pure, the concepts of white and black are very much a product of this racial enslavement period. And we need to try and move away from that. But I recognize that quite a lot of this language can seem strange and clunky, for the first time you hear it, and I think it's far from perfect. And I would love a bunch of historians and linguists and people to just get in a room and be locked there like a jury until they'd come up with a better language that everyone could agree on. But it's a start. I think we just need to be careful about the language we use in order to reflect that we don't just reproduce the language of the enslavers.
Thank you. I thought you did a great job in the text every time there was, a quote that would just refer to people as property, essentially, that you would often contextualize that and remind the viewer that, look, that is what they are doing there. And yeah, I thought that was great. So let's set the backdrop for the book. How did British colonization get started in the Caribbean, and how did slavery become such a dominant economic force there?
Well, that's a big subject. So in the Elizabethan period, Queen Elizabeth dies in 1603. You have a situation where Spain is the most powerful nation on earth. They have an empire predominantly in South America and the Caribbean, that is being that has developed a system of enslaved labor. The Portuguese are sort of pioneers of the trafficking of enslaved Africans across the Atlantic. And British, well, not British, they're English, because we don't have the Act of Union until 1707. But anyway, so the English see how wealthy the Spanish Empire is and want a piece of it. And you have people, as I wrote about in Black Tudors, you have John Hawkins, who was the first Englishman to sort of start trying to traffic Africans. In the 1560s, he conducted 4 trafficking expeditions, but he was selling these enslaved Africans to Spanish colonies, and because there were no English colonies, and the Spaniards sort of made it quite clear that they didn't want him interloping into their trade. So they attacked his fleet in 1568. And after that, the English don't really attempt to do the same thing until the 1640s. But at the same time, you have people like Francis Drake raiding Spanish colonies for treasure, and so the English are trying to get in on it, but they don't found their first colony, of course, until 1607, when they arrive in Jamestown, Virginia. And that it's all part. The Caribbean is not a separate enterprise to North America. It's all part of a kind of ecosystem, or a strategy. They're trying to emulate Spanish success. And so they begin in the early 17th century, in the reign of James I, to establish their earliest colonies in North America and the Caribbean. You have Virginia in 1607, and then quite soon after that, Bermuda, St. Kitts, and then Barbados, where the English first arrive in 1627, but really get settled from 1629. And many scholars see Barbados as the kind of crucible where the whole system of enslavement and sugar production in the British context gets going. But to start with, the labour is indentured white labour from Britain. Sometimes prisoners of war were sent there, or criminals, but just people wanting to try something different. Sort of in a similar way that you find in early Virginia. But in Barbados, it's the imperatives of sugar production. So it's the I think in general in the Caribbean, it's the crops that they want to produce, like sugar, predominantly sugar, but they're also growing coffee and ginger and various other things. But sugar becomes the monoculture, and the nature of sugar production really requires extreme hard labor, and it's the imperatives of that particular economy that is established in Barbados with sugar production, and also the kind of example of what the Spaniards have been doing. So the Spaniards and Portuguese. So the in the early years of sugar production in Brazil, in the early years of sugar production in Barbados, they actually bring Africans from Brazil to Barbados to help them understand how to grow sugar.
So to jump back to Britain, how much of the gentry and aristocracy depended financially on this trade from the West Indies? I mean, obviously you can't give like a percentage, but in general, how widespread were the connections?
Well, when enslavement comes to an end in the 1830s in Britain, there are compensation payments made to all the enslavers to compensate them for their loss of human property. And payouts are made to over 3,000 different families in the UK. That's the families. So there's a lot of different individuals within that, and obviously compensation is also paid to people still living in the Caribbean, and also Mauritius. There are people from Mauritius in that database as well. So it's significant. I think when we look at how Britain profited from enslavement, as I did in that initial survey with English Heritage, we look at quite a broad picture of not just plantation owners who enslaved people in the Caribbean, but also those who invested in trafficking across the Atlantic, and merchants of all those different goods, but also people selling plantation supplies back to the plantations, because the economic system dictated that the Caribbean islands were sugar monocultures, and so everything from nails to mosquito nets to casks for holding the sugar or the rum, were shipped out from the Caribbean. Sorry, they were all shipped out from Britain. So it's just a very broad number of ways in which Britain was profiting from this endeavor.
Yeah, I've thought about that historically in the United States as well. And while I was reading the book, that I mean, society benefits so much from it. Even people who aren't actively involved in enslavement are, what they're buying and selling, what the people they're buying and selling from are making their money in, and it's so difficult to really try to separate it out as a facet of society when it's really, I mean, so much of society is built on it.
And you can literally build on it. So you can see, one of the enslavers in my book invests in building better roads in the west of Scotland, or there are, parish churches that are enhanced or even built, by some of these families as well, or or some of our national institutions. There's a man called Hans Sloane who married a Jamaican heiress and became a extensive collector, and his collections of manuscripts and objects and artifacts actually form the basis of the collections of the British Museum, the British Library, and the Natural History Museum, and also the Chelsea Physic Garden, which is more of a botanical space. So that we can find these connections to so many people and places and institutions in British society. banks are a big one. Railways. I was on the train to Bristol the other day, and I saw a lot about the engineer Isabard Kingdom Brunel at Bristol Station, but not a lot about who was paying him. And there were a significant number of Bristol merchants who were very keen to have a railway to transport things to London from Bristol and back. And Bristol's famously made a lot of money from trafficking, but also there were a lot of merchants there importing things like sugar and rum.
To pivot a little, what do we know about the lives of people enslaved to enrich these colonies and people back home, and the indigenous people that were displaced in favor of the colonies, a process that was still ongoing in the time that you discuss in Heiresses?
Well, I think it's harder to know the biographical details of the lives of enslaved and indigenous people because of the nature of the sources that we have to draw on. In my book, there's a big imbalance between the women and their families that are written about, who we have lots of their letters and diaries and all sorts of paperwork on what they were up to. But with the enslaved people, it's harder, though not impossible, to understand elements of their lives. But quite a lot of the time, we are having to sort of read between the lines of documents that were not designed to tell us a huge amount about their lives. But I think, but I mean, with the one of the sources that is quite familiar to scholars of enslavement is the valuations that were produced. So there were lots of lists of the names of enslaved people with values assigned to them. These were drawn up sometimes when somebody had just inherited an estate, or they could be in a probate inventory. So that's quite shocking in itself, isn't it, that now if you die, with a probate inventory is when you list all the property that belonged to somebody when they died, so that you can value it and come up with how much inheritance tax they ought to pay, perhaps. But you find these probate inventories, and there's a list of all their household goods, tables and chairs. But then there's a list there's a list of animals, mules and cattle, and there's also lists of names of actual people, but they're on the list with all the other property. Sorry, and then later on in the early 19th century, Parliament passed a law to say that they wanted registers made of the enslaved people on the plantations, and so then we have lists every 3 years. Well, to start with, there's a long list, and then every 3 years they record births and deaths up until 1832. But so those are just scraps of information, but they do tell us things about these people. Their age, sometimes whether they were born in the Caribbean or in Africa. Sometimes you can trace family trees because there are records of who the mother was, although very rarely who the father was. It's partly because the law of chattel enslavement, enslaved status passed through the mother. And what else and the names themselves are interesting. Quite often, these names are mostly imposed by the enslaver, and they can often be kind of quite fanciful things like classical names like Cato or Scipio, but also British place names. So you find people called Bristol or Banff or Southampton or things like that. But there are some African names that survive all that. So you get kind of Akan Day names like Kwaku or Afua, although sometimes they are kind of garbled by English transcriptions, but they're there. So that will give you a sense of where in Africa some of them might have come from. But there are sort of other sources where we get a bit more detail. I mean, one of the shocking and fascinating pieces of evidence that I encountered in the book was in Barbados at the Newton burial ground. So Newton estate that was inherited by the heiress in chapter 1. They found the largest, extremely large undisturbed burial ground of enslaved people, and the archaeologists in the 1970s and 1990s unearthed some of these skeletons and analysed them, and that gives us a very clear and scientific picture of the sort of brutality of everyday life for enslaved people. They estimated an average life expectancy of 19.97 years. And they find injuries in the skeleton, in the sort of shin bones, for example, and evidence of various diseases. There's even sort of congenital syphilis, which means that children were born with sexually transmitted diseases. So that's quite stark. But then the moments that are really special are when you do find more kind of human stories in the archive. Again, in Newton Plantation, we've in the papers that are held in London, there are actually letters from enslaved people to their enslavers, and which shows that some of them were literate. And there's this amazing story of Betsy Newton, who actually escapes from Barbados and escapes all the way to London via St Vincent to demand freedom from her enslavers. And it's great when we can kind of read between the lines of documents that the enslavers really didn't intend to be used for this purpose. So there's a couple of sort of polemic pamphlets that one of the attorneys of the estate I looked at in chapter 8, and he's arguing against emancipation, but he uses examples of enslaved people that he has known in Jamaica, and we can pull those out and cross-reference them sometimes with those lists of names as well, too, and therefore be able to add some sort of human stories to those lists of names.
Yeah, that is another of the things I really enjoyed about your book is that you do put in the work to try to draw out as much as you can about these individuals from the very, very small amount remaining about them.
I didn't answer about Indigenous people. There was with the Indigenous people, I've found it, probably even harder to find information on some of the places. Some of the islands didn't have an Indigenous population by the time the English got there, and others had some, or had a very small. So, for example, Jamaica, the English capture from the Spaniards in 1655, and that had a significant Taino population. But by the time the English get there, most of them had died out through being essentially worked to death by the Spaniards. But some of them had escaped into the hinterland and formed independent maroon communities in conjunction with enslaved Africans who had escaped. So that's quite interesting. And there's a lot of archaeological evidence of the Taino in Jamaica. And the stories of Indigenous people that I encountered in the most depth. And again, I wasn't doing a survey; I was following the lives of these 9 women. But one of them, Martha Baker, who becomes Martha Swinburne, inherited an estate in St Vincent, and that led me into discovering a lot more about the Indigenous people of that region and the neighbouring islands. And they were known at the time as Caribs, which is where the word Caribbean comes from. But we now think of them as Kalinago, which scholars think is closer to the name that they would have used for themselves. And there were significant numbers of them in, I can't remember if it's the Leeward Islands or the Wind. But there were significant numbers of them, and there were quite a lot of military clashes from the 17th century onwards. So you find there are places in that part of the world that are still called names like Massacre because of some of the military threat. And at St Vincent, I learned a lot about the Garifuna, who were Indigenous people there. And there were two known as the 2 Carib Wars there, because they still held a significant part of the island, and the English, had real trouble capturing it from them, and there were two significant wars about it. And the French were fighting on the same side as the Garifuna because the French held neighboring islands. So that we got a bit more detail. There's a lot more detail in the archives about the Garifuna, but again, it's all through the eyes of a lot of it is through the eyes of the enslavers.
Thank you. Okay, now I am going to turn to the heiresses since we've been sort of discussing their broader social context so much. So a lot of the time we discuss women historically as marginalized. Typically they might be part of a transfer of wealth from one family to another, but not so much being in charge of it or being heiresses. So how do these women fit into the normal social context of what we expect of women in Georgian Britain and its wider world?
Well, I think whenever historians actually look at the lives of women, they challenge expectations of what they were up to. There obviously were social constraints. I mean, there were at least two women in the book who I think, if they were alive today, would have become members of parliament. They had pretty strong political views. One of them, Jane Lee Perrott, who was actually Jane Austen's aunt, actually wrote in a letter at one point that she wished she'd been an MP. And another one, Elizabeth Vassall, who becomes Lady Holland, is the wife of a politician, and you very much she critiques his speeches in the House of Lords, and very much is the kind of power behind the throne there, and seems much more political than he is. So I think partly these women, because they'd inherited great wealth, that gave them more clout and more sometimes more power in their marital relationships as well. I think especially the women in the book, the wealth doesn't transfer automatically to their husbands when they get married, because their family have sort of ring fenced it in these marriage settlements. So the money tends to go into trust, and so the sort of woman has a bit more clout, as I said. And I think, and luckily, it's quite lucky sometimes, because one of the women in the book, Anna Susanna Watson Taylor, if all the wealth had gone to her husband, he would have spent it all. But it's ring fenced so when he goes bankrupt, they're able to keep their house and estate in Wiltshire because it was bought by the trustees rather than by him. But they still have to go on the run from their creditors to Europe and then Edinburgh. But that's another story. So I think, and also in the book, some of the women spend a lot of time managing the plantations. When they are before they get married. Some of them inherit before they get married, and also when they're widows as well. They kind of get more actively involved at that point as well.
So how did you choose the specific heiresses that you wrote about, your 8 women in the book? Are they
9.
particularly oh, 9, sorry. Are they particularly representative of the norm, or did they actually stand out from the norm of Caribbean heiresses?
So when I started this project, I did a sort of survey, usually using very heavily, actually, the University College London Legacy of British Slavery database, which maps biographies of all those families who were compensated at the end of enslavement, and to look for heiresses. And I was looking for women who had a significant amount of wealth and had married in Britain as well. To sort of that transfer of wealth to Britain was important to me. But it was actually quite easy to. Well, I mean, it was quite quick to narrow it down. I had a long list of 22, and then got down to 9. And my criteria again were for them to be very wealthy, for them to have had like really dramatic life stories, and connections to sort of broader British and world history, but really importantly as well, to have a big archival footprint. So I wanted letters, diaries, like strong material on them and who they were. And that was probably, that last requirement was probably the thing that narrowed it down the fastest. Because we were, as you were saying, women, it is harder to find women in the archive than men.
It's true. And that would definitely influence, I think, any scholar studying this topic. Who has the paperwork left? So what were these women's like, sort of more broadly? What are the commonalities between them? If there are
Hmm.
commonalities, or we could discuss the differences.
Well, I think I'm not sure. I mean, the main thing they had in common was inheriting profits from enslavement, but they do have quite different life stories. I'd say quite a lot of them weren't very happy. But money don't buy you love. But I think that I'd say there's. I mean, one interesting distinction is between the ones that were born in the Caribbean and then came to England or Scotland as children. Quite often, young children, particularly young girls, were sent to Britain for education as quite young. So some of the girls, some of them in the book, were sort of coming to England, when they were sort of 6 or 9, not quite young. There's only one heiress in the There's one heiress in the book who doesn't move to Britain until she's 20, but she's sort of an exception. And then there are a couple of women in the book who never go to the Caribbean. They're born in Britain and they just inherit this wealth through family members. That fits into a broader narrative that there were relatively few white women living in the Caribbean. There were far more British men living there than British white women, and that sort of ties into this. I think I obviously knew before I started the research that white men were in sexual relations with enslaved women or mixed heritage women, but the prevalence of it in the sources that I found was a lot higher than I'd imagined. But what else do they have in common or different? Well, there's a couple of certainly a couple of cases of adultery and divorce in there. Um, and well, I don't know. I mean, what did you spot? We could talk
I mean,
about.
for me, what really stood out was in general the not so happy financial situations, that as much as I sort of expected it to be, here are these very wealthy women, they're so caught up in, oh, and then, my father did this silly financial thing, with our main estate, and I'm trying to get people to pay me back, and they won't pay me back because, for various reasons, because they don't want to pay, obviously, and this sort of thing. I didn't realize how much of their business was taken up with, yeah, this was mortgaged and I'm trying to unmortgage it, or yeah, all these financial woes of the very rich.
Yeah, I suppose that's something that I think there is a thread that a lot of them were much more involved in the actual day-to-day sort of business of managing these properties or dealing with the fallout when it goes wrong. And you can see that in the letters with the attorneys. So I think, again, that's why we have better sources for these stories, is because these families left the Caribbean. They then had to correspond with the people in the Caribbean who were known as attorneys, because they had power of attorney to act for them on the islands. They corresponded with them heavily to sort of try and manage things from afar, but that was quite hard. Another strain of the story is how precarious some of these fortunes were. People kept on dying. There was death, and disease. There were storms. There were hurricanes. The weather. Or there were borer ants that were borer larvae that were sort of eating the crops, or things were going wrong on. And then there were uprisings of enslaved people on a regular basis. So there were all sorts of ways in which their fortunes were threatened.
That's a good point, that if they have problems, there's more documentation than if they're just successful then.
I also thought it was really interesting, the interplay between those dramas and their personal lives, and how, you know, the fortunes of the enslaved people were sort of so directly intertwined with the fortunes of their enslavers. I mean, one example I think is when Isabella Cooper, who's comes from the Franks family, in chapter 8, when her father dies without a will and turns out to be in massive debt, you know, that directly leads to her and her husband not being able to afford to live in London, but a family friend sort of offers them the use of his home in London and his home in the country. And then shortly afterwards, her husband runs off with Lady Cadogan, who's their host. And that leads to this kind of scandalous adultery case, and so I think you've got that interplay between, you know, and again, like, you know, Martha Swinburne has got she has lots of children, and when things go wrong in St Vincent, she's, you know, worried about how to support them all. I mean, this is supporting them in the style to which they're accustomed. I mean, these people aren't going hungry, and their lives are in no way comparable to the lives of the people they're enslaving, but there are these sort of knock-on consequences. So, you know, her daughter gets married off to a rich man that's not certainly an older man. It's certainly not a love match, and that doesn't go well. And, you know, there's all these kind of personal consequences on both sides of the
Definitely.
Atlantic.
So you mentioned the Jane Austen connection earlier, and I think we need to talk about that because I think that's a great entry point for a lot of people. Jane Austen's relationship through family to the British West Indies.
Well, it's a funny one because there's been quite a lot of, I'd say, storms in teacups before about Jane Austen and enslavement, and people, you know, have published some of the connections. People have published some of the connections, like her father was a trustee for an estate in Antigua, or, you know, there was a big kind of bust up because the Jane Austen Museum was reported as that they were going to talk about how Jane Austen drank tea and therefore was connected to enslavement because the tea had sugar in it and that sort of thing. And, you know, there are those broader points to be made about British society in Austen's era, but it's not really a kind of caught red-handed moment, I don't think, on the scale of things. But so I was quite surprised that it's not more common knowledge about her aunt, who was from Barbados. And by the time Jane Austen was an adult, this woman was her only living aunt, and so she refers to her as my aunt. She's So Jane Austen's mother was born Cassandra Lee, and her brother was called James Lee Perrott. He'd added the name Perrott in order to get an inheritance from the Perrott family. And he marries Jane Lee Perrott, who I call Jenny in the book because I'm on first name terms with these women. But in that chapter, I'm talking about Jane Austen so much that I didn't want two Janes. So Jenny was born in Barbados and inherited wealth from Barbados, but nobody seems to talk about it, partly because I think they got distracted by the fact that she gets arrested for shoplifting in Bath and put on trial for shoplifting. She gets off, and but so I think that sort of is so dramatic that people get distracted. But there are these letters in the Austen papers all about her and her efforts to get a bigger inheritance from her mother in Barbados, and it's quite a kind of dramatic story too. So I traced down her family in Barbados, and I, you know, visited where the plantation they were involved with was, and So I just think that's another aspect and important to sort of think about when we're looking at Jane Austen's work as well. I mean, there are at least 3 Austen characters that scholars think might have been partly inspired by this woman as well. So it's interesting, but, you know, I think we shouldn't be surprised to find this kind of story in Austen's world, and I'm sure the more that scholars dig, the more they're going to find more connections to enslavement. You know, for example, Jane Austen's sister Cassandra. I think most people who've looked into the Austen family know about her being engaged to a guy called Thomas Fowle, who then dies before they can get married, and how this is a sort of tragic love affair. But not that many people know that Thomas Fowle actually died in Saint-Domingue, which was Haiti, in the Caribbean, where the British had gone to try and capture the island from the French after the Haitian Revolution. So, while the Haitian Revolution was taking place, they were trying to take over the island. So I think there are all these connections that people aren't aware of, but that perhaps shouldn't be surprised by.
What do you, if you do, what do you make of the very, very few references to enslavement in Austen? Because I've actually, I've come across people saying, "Oh, she did refer to, Mansfield Park," or, there's one small reference here, and I'm funny because I've never heard anybody else say that her aunt, was an heiress who benefited wildly from enslavement. So do you what do you make of that she Austen herself? I'm sure this is a sort of convoluted question.
Yeah, I think I know what you're saying. Yeah, and I forgot to mention, obviously, something I came across was that actually Jane Austen did inherit £50 from another Barbados heiress that she met through her aunt, which doesn't sound so much today, but actually covered her expenses for a whole year and allowed her to rent a piano. So I think that's something that is a direct financial connection to enslavement and Jane Austen. That, although it was known, amongst scholars, perhaps, it was published in a scholarly article 20 years ago, but that hasn't reached sort of public consciousness either. But yeah, I don't want to tread on any Austenian fan toes. I live in fear that the Janeites will come for me. And I love Jane Austen's stories as much as the next British person. And I was a teenager when the Colin Firth adaptation of Pride and Prejudice came out, and just love it. And I've recently got my daughters into it as well, and like that gives me great joy because they are great stories. They're great stories and some just hilarious characters. We saw Pride and Prejudice in our local theatre, open air theatre in the summer, and there was one actor and he was playing Mr. Darcy and Mr. Collins, and the way he changed his body language when he became Mr. Collins was absolutely hilarious. So, I love those stories, and I can understand why people want Jane Austen to be anti-slavery and an abolitionist. But it does feel like you have to make a lot of effort to read those narratives into the texts. But I mean, I don't think that on the surface, at least, the stories have got a lot to say about the wider world of politics and what's going on in the wider world in general. I mean, they feel um, primarily stories about relationships and the marriage plot and loves won and lost and the stupid character quirks, the stupid character not twerk, the stupid. They seem to be about characters and relationships on on an interpersonal level, and yeah. So I don't think I think perhaps she doesn't engage that much with the contemporaneous. She doesn't engage that much with the contemporaneous debates about enslavement, partly because she doesn't really engage that much with. But again, there are probably scholars who spent their entire careers writing about Jane Austen and the wider world who will not like this. Yeah. So.
Okay. So is there anything else you'd specifically like to discuss that we haven't hit on so far?
Well, I mean, I suppose that I just enjoy some of the. I think there are some quite amusing / crazy moments in these life stories, like when Elizabeth Vassal, who's by then Lady Webster, tries to fakes her own daughter's death in Italy, or the another heiress who gets a horrible poem written about her by Robert Burns straight after she dies because her funeral cortege have kicked him out of a pub in Scotland in the middle of a cold January storm. So there are those kind of colourful and strange incidents, or another heiress who's actually in Paris at the time of the French Revolution and tries to offer Marie Antoinette a chance to escape in her coach dressed as her maid, But then it's lucky she didn't. Marie Antoinette said no, because Martha gets accosted in Boulogne and almost doesn't get out of France herself. So I think there's those. I think in the book, I've tried to kind of give a balance between those sort of crazy stories and that kind of consciousness of the exploitation, the brutal exploitation that kind of underwrites these women's lives. And there are some kind of quite stark contrasts. But I suppose people will have to get into the book to read about some of those stories in more detail.
Yes, I think so. So definitely everybody who's listening, go to your local book retailer. If you are in the UK, you can pick it up right now. And if you're in the US, please put in a pre-order for Heiresses, Marriage, Inheritance, and Caribbean Slavery. Thank you so much for being here. I really enjoyed this interview. I hope it wasn't too much of a bite out of your morning.
No, it's good. It's good. Great. Well, thanks so much for your interest, and I'm really glad you enjoyed the book. And hopefully people in America will be interested in it as well.
Oh, I'm sure. Can't wait for your next one.
Oh, I can. Not too much work. Great. All right. Thanks, Cassidy.
Okay, thank you. Bye.
You've been listening to the Ask Historians podcast. Please support us at patreon.com/askhistorians. Find more history like this by following us on Twitter and Facebook, and by visiting us at askhistorians.reddit.com and ask hundreds of historians and enthusiasts anything you want to know about history.